Today's topic is the Cold War, which wasn't a war at all. It was an armed standoff combined with an arms race to continually improve nuclear weapons and build more of them under the false impression that the country that had more nuclear weapons would win a war. It had been known since Hiroshima that nobody wins a nuclear war. If the war is big enough, then the fallout from all the weapons used extends around the globe, at least in the northern hemisphere, perhaps not in the south. The strategy that evolved was called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD, MAD for short. This picture illustrates it. The idea is that either side is capable of killing the other, but there's a delay between the launch of an attack and the killing of the enemy. And during that delay period, the enemy can launch a counterattack which can be as effective or more effective than the original attack. So the net result of either participant starting a war is that both will be destroyed. During the arms race, although it was estimated that only about 400 nuclear weapons would be sufficient to knock either the USSR or the USA out of existence as a functioning society and a functioning economy, nevertheless, the numbers of weapons that were produced were far in excess of that, partly as a result of capitalistic greed by weapons manufacturers, and partly as a consequence of cowardice, the unwillingness to lose even a single person in war can lead to a ridiculous overbuilding of munitions. You can see from this graph that the nuclear weapons built by the USSR had a tremendous peak in the 1980s. And that was the result of a particularly ill-considered policy which was cooked up by Edward Teller, and endorsed by Ronald Reagan, with an emphasis on nuclear missile defense, which doesn't work. Even today, the best nuclear missile defense we can muster is about 50% effective. And not many people are comfortable knowing that half of 1,000 nuclear-tipped missiles will be shot down. The introduction of this defensive force caused the Russians to increase their offensive missiles, and in so doing, they managed to bankrupt their society and bring about the end of the Soviet Union. So, a lot of people thought that the Cold War was over then, until this guy took charge of Russia, and he intends to renew the balance of power which existed between the USA and the USSR during the Cold War. And so we are still in a Cold War, only now instead of the USSR, we're facing the Russian Empire. A useful displacement activity in any mortal struggle is displays of power without actual combat. We see this in a lot of deer species, where the males will show off the majesty of their antlers instead of actually fighting with them, and thereby scare off the lesser of the two competitors. During the Cold War, we showed off the majesty of our weapons with so-called nuclear weapons tests. Now, there are really three kinds of nuclear weapons tests that were carried out during the Cold War. A total of over 2,000 nuclear weapons were discharged during that period. Last time we talked about Ivy Mike and Castle Bravo, which were genuine experiments. They were intended to establish the practicality of thermonuclear weapons, and nobody really knew what their yield would be, how much fallout they would produce, etc. The second kind of nuclear testing was to actually improve the design and manufacture of nuclear bombs once we knew we could make them. And the third kind of nuclear weapons testing is show-off testing. Tests where we try to cow the enemy by showing them what we can do to him. This kind of show-off testing has been engaged in by many of the nuclear powers, though not all. For instance, the Israelis have never even acknowledged that they're a nuclear power. But at the opposite extreme, every time India or Pakistan sets off some nuclear weapons, the other side sets off a larger number, just to show how many they have in reserve. Next time, we'll go deeper into the question of actual bomb testing and talk about when and where it happened and what were its consequences for the world.